In the deep ocean, survival follows rules that feel almost mechanical. Pressure increases, light disappears, energy becomes rare, life simplifies, or it dies. And yet, drifting silently between 600 and 800 meters below the surface, there is a fish that does not simplify. It subtracts itself. At first glance, the barreleye fish appears unfinished. Its head is not opaque. Its skull does not hide what a skull is meant to protect. Instead, its face is a clear dome, soft, gelatinous, almost fragile, revealing its eyes, its nervous tissue, its most vulnerable machinery, openly exposed to the crushing dark. This alone feels like a mistake. In a place where pressure can deform metal and darkness erases reaction time, transparency seems like a fatal flaw. There is no armor, no pigmentation, no visual deception, and yet, this fish survives, not as an exception, but as a specialist. The scientific name Macropinna microstoma translates loosely to small mouth with a large barrel, a reference not to its feeding power, but to the shape of its eyes. Eyes that do not face forward, eyes that do not face outward, eyes that point up. Inside the transparent dome, two green, tubular eyes stare permanently toward the faint glow above, scanning for silhouettes of prey, drifting between layers of darkness. They do not move like normal fish eyes. They rotate internally, pivoting within the skull itself, protected only by the fragile membrane that replaces a solid head. This anatomy violates expectations. Most fish rely on speed, camouflage, or armor. The barreleye relies on exposure. To understand why, the environment must be stripped down first. At this depth, sunlight does not illuminate, it whispers. Only the faintest traces remain, filtered into narrow wavelengths that barely penetrate the water column. Predators do not chase. They wait. Food does not swim freely. It sinks slowly, unpredictably, like debris falling through space. Every calorie costs effort. Every movement must justify itself. In such an environment, vision becomes more valuable than muscle. Detection matters more than pursuit. The barreleye's eyes are not built for speed or detail. They are built for contrast, for catching the slightest shadow against the dying light above. But large, light-sensitive eyes come with a problem. They are vulnerable. Pigmented tissue blocks light. Bone absorbs photons. Traditional skull structures interfere with the very function these eyes evolved to perform. So, evolution did something unsettling. It removed the face. The transparent dome is not an adaptation for beauty or novelty. It is the absence of an obstacle. By replacing bone with a clear, fluid-filled shield, the fish allows light to reach its eyes without distortion. Nothing blocks the signal. Nothing interferes. The cost is obvious. The brain, sensory organs, and eyes are left with minimal protection. Any physical impact could be catastrophic. Any structural failure would be fatal. But in the deep sea, collisions are rare. There are no reefs, no sudden obstacles. Movement is slow, deliberate, suspended. Here, fragility can survive. The barreleye does not hunt aggressively. It hovers, nearly motionless, waiting for drifting organisms, especially jellyfish and siphonophores. Some evidence suggests it steals prey from the tentacles of these gelatinous creatures, navigating carefully between stinging cells using its precise upward vision. This behavior explains something else that feels wrong. Its mouth is tiny. In an environment where food is scarce, a small mouth seems inefficient. But large prey is rare. What exists are fragments, soft-bodied organisms, and suspended biological debris. A large jaw would waste energy. A small one conserves it. Every part of this fish reflects subtraction. Reduced armor, reduced aggression, reduced structure. What remains is perception. But transparency is not a gift. It is a compromise. Pigment protects against radiation. Bone protects against pressure fluctuations. Opaque tissue shields nerves from damage. The barreleye gives all of this up. It survives not because it is strong, but because the environment is quiet enough to tolerate weakness. And this is the unsettling truth of deep-sea evolution. Survival does not always favor robustness. Sometimes it favors exposure. Sometimes the only way to see is to remove everything that stands in the way, even if that means living without a face. The barreleye fish is not optimized for survival everywhere. It is optimized for nowhere else. And that raises a darker question. If transparency is not an advantage, but a last resort, what kind of evolutionary pressure forces an organism to abandon the very idea of protection? In the deep sea, pressure is not an external force. It is an architect. At 700 meters below the surface, every square centimeter of flesh is compressed by more than 70 times the atmospheric pressure at sea level. Bones do not resist this force. They surrender to it. Air-filled cavities collapse. Rigid structures become liabilities. This is where most familiar anatomy begins to fail. The barreleye fish does not fight pressure. It dissolves into it. Its body is soft, flexible, and lightly structured, composed largely of low-density tissue that compresses evenly. There are no gas-filled swim bladders, no hardened cranial plates, no rigid skeletal reinforcements that could fracture under stress. Instead, the fish floats in equilibrium, neither rising nor sinking, existing in a state closer to suspension than motion. This softness is not a weakness. It is survival through compliance. But pressure alone does not explain the most disturbing aspect of the barreleye's design, the transparent dome. This structure is often misunderstood as exposed vulnerability, but it is more precise to call it reallocated protection. The dome is filled with a clear, gelatinous fluid that maintains internal pressure balance while allowing light to pass almost unobstructed. The eyes sit inside this chamber like instruments in a pressure vessel, stable, motionless, shielded from sudden gradients. The dome is not glass. It does not crack. It flexes. What looks fragile is, in reality, pressure neutral. Still, the question remains, why accept transparency at all? The answer lies in scarcity. Food in the deep sea does not arrive reliably. It falls, it drifts, it disappears without warning. Chasing prey wastes energy. Missing prey can mean starvation. So the barreleye waits. Its tubular eyes are optimized for gathering as many photons as possible from above. Their shape increases sensitivity rather than resolution, sacrificing sharp imagery for early detection. The fish does not need to see details. It needs to see change, a shadow, a flicker, a silhouette crossing faint light. Once detected, the eyes rotate internally, shifting from upward surveillance to forward focus. This movement happens entirely within the transparent dome, without the need for external eye motion. No muscle movement, no silhouette change, no signal to predators. Stillness is protection, but even this system has limits. Large eyes demand neural processing power. Neural tissue is metabolically expensive. In an environment where calories are scarce, every extra neuron is a cost. To compensate, the barreleye's brain is relatively small and highly specialized. It does not process complex spatial environments. It does not plan. It does not react quickly. It observes. It decides slowly. It commits once. This is not intelligence. It is constraint. Even feeding reflects this restraint. Rather than attacking prey directly, evidence suggests the barreleye positions itself beneath jellyfish-like organisms, carefully navigating around their stinging tentacles. Some observations indicate it may steal trapped prey rather than capturing it itself. This behavior reduces risk. It reduces effort. It reduces energy loss. But it also limits opportunity. The fish cannot pursue fast prey. It cannot escape quickly. It cannot survive outside its narrow depth range. Every advantage is paired with a restriction. Transparency, too, carries a cost. Without pigmentation, the fish lacks protection from bioluminescent flashes that could overwhelm its sensitive eyes. Without bone shielding, it relies entirely on environmental stability. Sudden turbulence, rare but possible, could be fatal. And yet, the deep sea offers something the surface does not: predictability. Currents are slow. Light is constant in its absence. Temperature barely changes. In this environment, Specialization thrives. The barreleye fish is not an evolutionary triumph. It is an evolutionary concession, a body pared down to the minimum required to persist under relentless pressure and scarcity. Remove the unnecessary, expose the essential, accept fragility where force would fail. This is what survival looks like when options disappear. But such specialization creates a trap. The more perfectly an organism fits its environment, the less adaptable it becomes. Any shift, warming waters, altered currents, disrupted food chains, can collapse the balance entirely. The barreleye does not evolve quickly. It cannot migrate easily. It cannot compete elsewhere. Its design is frozen into a narrow slice of the ocean, an existence balanced on environmental stability. And that leads to a final, unsettling realization. This fish did not evolve transparency because it was advantageous in general. It evolved transparency because everything else stopped working. When pressure crushes structure, when darkness erases vision, when energy disappears, biology does not innovate freely. It retreats, it simplifies, it sacrifices, and in doing so, it creates forms that feel incomplete, yet persist. But how far can this retreat go before survival itself becomes untenable? In the deep ocean, sight should be obsolete. There is not enough light to form images the way surface animals understand them. Shapes dissolve into gradients. Edges vanish. Distance loses meaning. Most creatures abandon vision entirely, replacing it with vibration detection, chemical sensing, or passive drifting. The barreleye fish does not. Instead, it commits everything to vision, then strips vision down until it barely survives. Its eyes are enormous relative to its body, not because it needs clarity, but because it needs permission. Permission to detect even the weakest trace of photons filtering from above. Permission to notice when something interrupts that trace. This is not seeing prey. This is seeing absence. In the mesopelagic zone, prey rarely announces itself. It does not flash. It does not move fast. It drifts. And drift is almost invisible unless something breaks the uniform darkness. The barreleye's tubular eyes act like light collectors, increasing sensitivity by narrowing their field of view. They sacrifice peripheral awareness for depth. They stare upward, not because danger comes from above, but because food does. Dead organisms sink. Gelatinous animals hover. Small creatures migrate vertically, silhouetted briefly against what little light remains. Upward vision is the only vision that still matters. But this choice creates a profound vulnerability. By dedicating its eyes to one direction, the fish becomes blind to almost everything else. Predators approaching from the side or below would go unnoticed. Environmental changes outside its narrow visual cone may never register. To survive this blindness, the barreleye does something counterintuitive. It does almost nothing. Movement is minimized. Metabolism is slow. The fish holds position in the water column, reducing the chance of accidental encounters. It does not chase. It does not explore. It does not react unless absolutely necessary. Vision becomes a waiting game, and waiting reshapes the entire body. Muscles are weak because bursts of speed are rarely used. Fins are small because maneuverability is secondary to stability. The skeleton remains light because mass requires energy to maintain. Everything supports stillness, but stillness has consequences. In the deep sea, many predators rely on bioluminescence, flashes of light used to lure, confuse, or expose prey. For an animal with hypersensitive eyes, this is a threat. The barreleye has no eyelids, no shielding pigment, no ability to look away quickly. A sudden burst of light could overwhelm its visual system, temporarily blinding it or damaging neural tissue. This is another cost of transparency. Nothing filters the signal, yet bioluminescent attacks are relatively rare at its depth. Most aggressive light displays occur either deeper, where darkness is absolute, or shallower, where vision still functions normally. The barreleye occupies a narrow band between these extremes, a zone where light exists just enough to be useful, but not enough to be weaponized constantly. This is not coincidence, it is confinement. The fish does not dominate this zone. It merely fits into it. Even reproduction reflects this constraint. Little is known about barreleye mating behavior, but like many deep-sea fish, encounters are likely rare and opportunistic. There are no elaborate displays, no visual signals, no courtship rituals dependent on color or pattern. Transparency offers nothing here. Survival takes priority over reproduction, not because reproduction is unimportant, but because it is uncertain. Many deep-sea species invest little in parental care, producing offspring that drift into the darkness, most never reaching maturity. Life persists statistically, not individually. This shifts the evolutionary pressure further. Traits that improve long-term population survival matter more than traits that improve individual comfort or resilience. Fragile bodies are acceptable if the environment remains stable enough to prevent constant damage. But stability is an illusion. The deep ocean feels timeless, but it is not immune to change. Temperature shifts, altered currents, and declining oxygen levels creep slowly downward from the surface. Human activity has begun to disturb even these depths. Through noise, pollution, and climate-driven circulation changes. For a creature like the barreleye, adaptation options are limited. It cannot thicken its skull without blocking light. It cannot darken its tissues without losing sensitivity. It cannot relocate without abandoning the visual strategy it depends on. Its entire existence balances on a single sense that barely functions. This is the quiet horror of extreme specialization. At some point, optimization becomes fragility. The barreleye fish represents a form of evolution that does not build upward, but inward, compressing function until nothing remains but the bare minimum needed to persist. It sees just enough, moves just enough, consumes just enough. Any less, and it vanishes. Any more, and it fails. And this raises a deeper, more unsettling implication. If vision, once one of the most powerful tools in animal survival, can be reduced to this, if transparency becomes necessary rather than beneficial, what does that say about the limits of biological design under relentless pressure? Because in the deep sea, survival does not reward strength, it rewards endurance without margin. And organisms like the barreleye live exactly where margin disappears. In most environments, survival favors addition, more muscle, more armor, more speed, more complexity. In the deep sea, the logic reverses. Here, survival favors removal. The barreleye fish does not represent an advanced design. It represents a reduced one. A body carved down by pressure, darkness, and hunger until only the functions that cannot be discarded remain. This is not efficiency in the familiar sense. It is austerity. Every unnecessary trait becomes a liability when energy is scarce. Every extra gram of tissue demands oxygen, nutrients, and maintenance. In a world where meals arrive unpredictably, waste is lethal. So evolution begins cutting. The barreleye's muscles are thin, not because strength is unimportant, but because bursts of power are rarely useful. There is nothing to chase and nowhere to flee. Speed would only burn calories with no guarantee of return. Its fins are modest, shaped for hovering rather than maneuvering. Precision matters more than agility. Stability matters more than acceleration. Even its nervous system reflects restraint. Reaction times are slow. Responses are deliberate. There is no need for rapid decision-making when the environment changes at a glacial pace. This is a body built to wait. But waiting has consequences. The longer an organism remains still, the more it must accept vulnerability. A sudden predator encounter leaves little time to react. A change in current can displace it into unfamiliar territory. A brief lapse in detection can mean starvation. To tolerate this risk, the barreleye relies on predictability. The deep mid-water zone offers that predictability, not because it is safe, but because it is consistent. Light levels change little. Temperatures remain stable. Large-scale disturbances are rare. This stability allows fragility to persist. Transparency fits into this logic not as a clever adaptation, but as a concession. Bone and pigment interfere with light transmission. They are useful in dynamic environments where impacts, radiation, and visual complexity are common. Here, they become obstacles, so they are removed. What remains is a soft dome that does not resist the environment, but yields to it. The transparent head is not meant to protect against force. It assumes force will not arrive. This assumption defines the fish's entire existence, and assumptions are dangerous. The deep sea is changing. Warming surface waters alter circulation patterns, slowly shifting the delivery of nutrients downward. Oxygen minimum zones expand, reducing available respiration margins. Noise travels farther in dense water, disrupting sensory environments that evolved in near silence. For an organism with no redundancy, no spare capacity, no tolerance for error, these changes matter. The barreleye cannot compensate easily. It cannot switch to another sensory strategy. It cannot thicken its tissues without losing vision. It cannot move shallower without facing predators. It is not built to detect or evade. Its specialization is complete and therefore brittle. This is the paradox of extreme evolution. The more perfectly an organism matches its niche, the more dependent it becomes on that niche remaining unchanged. Success narrows possibility. In the barreleye, this narrowing is visible. You can see it through the skull. You can see the limits pressed directly against function. There is no excess, no buffer, no backup plan, and yet this fish persists, not because it thrives, but because it endures. Deep-sea survival is not about dominance. It is about avoiding failure long enough to reproduce once, maybe twice, before energy runs out or chance intervenes. From this perspective, the barreleye's design is not strange. It is honest. It reveals what happens when life is forced into a corner and told to continue anyway. When there is no room for strength, no room for protection, no room for complexity, only room for function stripped to its core. Transparency, then, is not a trait. It is a symptom, a visible sign that evolution has run out of material to work with, that the environment has extracted its price, and the organism has paid it in structure. And still, the fish drifts, eyes turned upward, body suspended, waiting for a shadow that means food rather than death. This is not a success story. It is a compromise that has lasted just long enough to seem stable. But stability in the deep sea is deceptive, because when an organism survives by removing everything it can afford to lose, the next loss may be one it cannot survive at all. And that leaves one final question hanging in the darkness. If this is what survival looks like at the edge, what happens when the edge moves? There is a moment in every extreme environment when adaptation stops being progress. Beyond that point, evolution no longer builds solutions. It merely delays collapse. The barreleye fish exists on that boundary. Its transparent head, its upward-locked vision, its fragile structure, these are not signs of future potential. They are evidence of limits reached. A body shaped not by opportunity, but by constraint so severe that almost nothing remained negotiable. In the deep sea, this is common, but rarely is it so visible. The barreleye allows us to look directly at what happens when biology is forced to survive without margin, when protection becomes optional, when redundancy disappears, when failure is avoided not by resilience, but by stillness. This fish does not recover from injury. It does not escape chaos. It does not adapt quickly. It persists only as long as the world around it stays quiet. That silence, once assumed permanent, is no longer guaranteed. The deep ocean was long treated as insulated from surface change, buffered by depth and distance. But pressure does not stop heat. Circulation does not stop disruption. Chemical imbalance does not respect depth. Changes arrive slowly, but they arrive everywhere. As oxygen levels decline and temperature gradients shift, the delicate balance that allows fragile organisms to exist begins to tilt. For species built with buffers, thick tissue, multiple sensory systems, behavioral flexibility, tilt is manageable. For the barreleye, It may not be. There is no alternative sensory pathway waiting to compensate if vision fails. No structural reinforcement that can be added without undermining the very function that keeps it alive. No behavioral strategy that allows escape from a changing depth zone. Its design is locked in, and that reveals something deeply uncomfortable about evolution. We often imagine it as a process that endlessly refines, improves, and innovates. But in extreme environments, evolution does something else entirely. It corners life. It removes options until survival itself becomes the only remaining function. And once that function is maximized, there is nowhere left to go. The barreleye fish is not poorly designed. It is fully spent. Every trait serves a purpose. Every weakness is tolerated because there is no energy left to correct it. Every risk is accepted because avoiding risk would cost more than enduring it. This is not adaptation toward abundance. It is adaptation toward endurance. And endurance has an expiration date. What makes the barreleye unsettling is not its transparency, but what that transparency represents. You are not seeing a clever trick of evolution. You are seeing the cost of existing where nothing else works. A skull removed because bone interfered with sight. Pigment removed because light was too precious to block. Strength removed because motion wasted calories. Eventually, removal becomes subtraction too far. At that point, survival is no longer robust. It is conditional, and conditional survival is fragile by definition. The barreleye continues to drift today because the deep sea still resembles the environment that shaped it. But the moment that resemblance breaks, by warming, deoxygenation, acidification, or disruption of food fall, the balance may collapse faster than evolution can respond. There will be no dramatic extinction event, no visible struggle, no final adaptation. The fish will simply fail to meet the conditions it requires and vanish. And that is perhaps the most honest lesson this creature offers. Life does not always end in catastrophe. Sometimes it ends in incompatibility. The barreleye fish reminds us that survival is not guaranteed by strangeness, ingenuity, or extremity. Survival is negotiated moment by moment with an environment that does not care how elegant the solution once was. Transparency worked until it doesn't. Stillness worked until movement becomes necessary. Fragility worked until disturbance arrives. In the deep sea, evolution can push life to exist without protection, without redundancy, without forgiveness. But it cannot push forever. And when you look at the barreleye, floating silently with its eyes exposed to the dark, you are not seeing a marvel of nature. You are seeing the shape life takes when it has already given up everything it could afford to lose.